Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This video is going to explain how to use PowerPivot Data Models. So the video is going to explain all about how to reference PowerPivot and create data models using VBA. We're going to start by looking at how to add a connection to the data model to get it created in the first place, and then how you can create pivot tables using the data model. So that's going to include how you can reference cube fields and create measures to create the data fields in your pivot table. A little later on we'll look at how you can connect to Access and SQL Server databases and import that data into the data model. And when we're doing that we'll look at how you can import and create relationships in the data model. The final part of the video is going to explain how you can reference multiple different data sources and pull them all together into one single model so you can create a pivot table as though it was based on just one single entity. That's quite a powerful technique. Quite a lot to do in this one. Let's get started. The starting point for this video is this basic Excel Movies workbook. If you don't already have a copy, you can download it using the link in the video description. You'll also need to make sure of a couple of other things before you get started. First of all, you need to make sure you're working in Excel 2013 or later, because the techniques we're using in this video won't work in Excel 2010 or earlier. You'll also need to ensure that you've got access to the PowerPivot add-in. So just to check that that's actually loaded, you can head to the Developer tab in the ribbon and choose COM add-ins, and then on the dialog box that appears, make sure that there's a check next to the box for the Microsoft Office PowerPivot for Excel and whichever version you're using, and then click OK to make sure that that's actually loaded. You may or may not have access to the PowerPivot tab in the ribbon. It'd be better if you do have it available, so if it's not there already, you can right click on any existing tab in the ribbon and choose Customize the ribbon, and then scroll down the list on the right hand side until you can find the checkbox for PowerPivot. If you tick the box and then click OK, you'll then have access to all the tools available on that tab of the ribbon. The basic idea behind PowerPivot is it lets you take data from multiple different sources and combine them into one single data model contained within the workbook. And that allows you then to create pivot tables based on data from multiple different locations, all queried as though it was one single gigantic table effectively. Now if you're interested in more about how PowerPivot works in general, we do have a video series on how Power BI tools in Excel 2013 work, and there's a section in there all to do with getting started with PowerPivot and then the various things you can do with it. So if you're interested more in the background of PowerPivot, that's the video series to watch. What we're going to do in this video is talk about how you write VBA code to create a data model and then create pivot tables based on that data model. So to get started, let's head to the Developer tab and into the Visual Basic Editor, and as usual we'll insert a new module, and I'm going to create a first simple subroutine called Create Basic Model. The first basic data model that we're going to create is going to consist of just one single table of data, and it's all the data that we've just been looking at on that Movies worksheet. Now ordinarily, if you were going to create a pivot table based on data in the same workbook, then all you need to do is refer to the range of cells that you want to base the pivot table on when you create your pivot cache. But when you're using a PowerPivot data model, that's not quite the same. To add a table of data in the same Excel workbook to the PowerPivot data model, you've first of all got to have a connection to that table. So that's the first thing that we have to do in our subroutine. So let's head back to the VB editor, and the first thing we'll do is say this workbook dot connections dot add to. Then there's several parameters we need to fill in. The first couple are pretty straightforward. Let me just separate these across on multiple lines, and I'll name my parameters as we go along so we can see what we're doing. So the name parameter I'm going to make equal to Movies Excel. And then we can have a description. The description parameter's compulsory, so we have to provide a value to it, but we don't actually need to provide a description. We can just leave that empty. So I'm going to say description colon equals, and then open and close and double quotes to pass in an empty string. Now the next couple of parameters are a little bit more important. The next one's the connection string itself. Now for connection strings to an Excel worksheet or a table in an Excel worksheet, the very first part of the connection string must be the word worksheet. You can then follow that with the semicolon, and then if you know the file name and folder path of the workbook that you want to connect to, you can enter that as a literal string. So if I knew, for instance, that it was in C:/ my folder, and then it was called book1.xls or whatever, that would be a perfectly acceptable connection string. The problem with that, of course, is it's quite unreliable, not to mention that it's not actually the file name and folder path of the workbook that I want to connect to. So more reliably than that, I'm going to just delete that string back to the semicolon, close the double quotes, and then type in an ampersand to concatenate this with a property of the workbook object. So I can say this workbook.full name. So that will return the full file name and folder path and file name extension of the workbook, meaning that it's a little bit more robust. If I decide to save it with a different name or move its location, this will still work. The next thing I can do is specify the command text. So if I have a space underscore and say command text, for an Excel worksheet, the command text is the name of the worksheet followed by the cell references on that worksheet. So again, if I knew that this was going to be a fixed range of cells on a fixed worksheet name, then I could enter this as a literal string. So movies, which is the name of the sheet, followed by an exclamation mark, and then A1 : 365-ish or so. But again, if that range of cells changes or the worksheet name changes, that's not a particularly useful technique. So instead what I'll do is use some properties of the worksheet object. So I'm going to say wsmovies.name, which will ensure that if somebody changes the worksheet name later on in Excel, this won't matter. Then I can concatenate that with an exclamation mark character, and then concatenate that, beg your pardon, with the range of cells. So if I say wsmovies.rangeA1, I can then refer to the current region property of those cells, and then refer to the address property of that to return the cell references of that range of cells. Just a few more properties still to go then. These are slightly more simple. So the next property is the command type that I'm going to use. So the name of the parameter is called L command type, or CMD type, and this is going to be equal to one of the Excel command types. So a nice way to see what possible options there are here is to say Excel command type, CMD type, and then in there, if you type in a full stop, you'll see a list of all of the available command types. Now for this particular example, the choice is fairly easy. We're referring to an Excel worksheet, so the type is Excel command Excel. Then the two final properties or parameters to fill in. The create model connection parameter. This is the really important one here. If we want to actually create our PowerPivot data model, we can specify that the create model connection parameter should be equal to true. So that will actually generate the PowerPivot data model when this connection gets created. We can also fill in, although it's not that important right now, the import relationships parameter. We will talk a bit more about relationships later on in the video, but for now there aren't any relationships to import, so we're going to set that parameter value to false. And that's all the code required to create both a connection to this worksheet and the PowerPivot data model as well. All we have to do now then to create the connection and the data model is to run the subroutine, and once that's finished we'll have to go back into Excel to check that it's actually worked. So back into Excel, we can first of all check that the connection exists fairly easily by heading to the Data tab in the ribbon and choosing Connections, and we ought to see that our new connection called Movies Excel is sitting there. There's also a new connection that we didn't create explicitly but was created automatically because we chose to create the model connection as well when we created the original connection. Now if you want to see what that model looks like, I can close down the Workbook Connections dialog box, and then on the PowerPivot tab in the ribbon I can click the Manage button. That will actually fire up the separate PowerPivot application, and it shows me that essentially what I've done here is created a copy of all the data from that workbook, from that worksheet I should say, into a single PowerPivot table. There's also a diagram view of this. If I click on the diagram view button, and I can see that I've got a basic diagram representing this table here as well, showing me all the column names. Now the slightly unfortunate thing about this, although it works, the slightly unfortunate thing is that it just gives the range of cells a generic name like range, which is going to make it very awkward to reference in the final pivot table. So at this point I'm just going to close down the PowerPivot application and switch back to Excel, and then back into the VB editor. I'm going to look at one other technique we can use to make this naming of tables a little bit more convenient. Let's just make a quick copy of this subroutine then so we can see the difference between the two techniques, and if we paste it in we can change its name so it's called something like using range name. Now a range name is, well, it's literally that. It's a name that refers to a range of cells. You can create them manually in Excel, but it's much more convenient for us to create it as part of this code. So let's have a quick look at copying something here first of all. Let's say WSMovies range A1 current region. I'm going to copy that part of the line and then paste it in, and then refer to the name property of that range of cells and make it equal to something. Let's make it equal to something like movie range. If I can spell movie properly, that would always help. So once I've created that range name, what I can now do is reference it as part of the command text. But the way you do this is slightly different to referencing the cell references for these cells. So rather than refer to a worksheet, what we do in here is refer to the workbook name first of all. So I'm going to say this workbook.name, followed by an ampersand, and then in some double quotes, an exclamation mark, then the same range name that I've just typed in there, movie range, and then close the double quotes. At that point then, all I've got to do is run the subroutine, and again it's going to create a new connection, still called Movies Excel, or that will have changed automatically, but the important thing is that the object or the table that's added to the data model will be called movie range. So let's just have a quick look to it to make sure that that's the case. If I switch back into Excel, first of all, you can check that your range name exists by heading to the drop-down list at the top of the worksheet. So this is the name box, and you see you've got movie range sitting in there. If you select movie range, then it shows you which block of cells it references. If I'm on the data tab, I can click on the connections page, and I should find that I've got a new Movies Excel1 connection, which is related to my range name. Then if I close that down and head to the PowerPivot tab in the ribbon, I can click on the Manage button, and then I'll end up in the PowerPivot Data Model with a movie range table, which has exactly the same data as my original range, and that's also on the diagram view, of course, so it's got a much more convenient name listed there. So creating range names is a much easier way to control exactly what table names you get added to the data model. Let's just close down PowerPivot and switch back to the VB editor. Just before we go any further, it's worthwhile quickly mentioning how you can remove tables from the data model. Each workbook only has one single data model available, so it's worthwhile keeping it clean and tidy by removing tables you no longer need. So for example, we created an original table called range in the data model with this original connection called Movies Excel. Now just in the same way that you add tables to the data model when you create a connection, you can remove tables from the data model by deleting that connection. So let's have a quick extra subroutine just down below called remove single connection. And then in there, all we're going to do is delete the connection that was originally created called Movies Excel. So to do that, I can say this workbook.connections, then open some parentheses and in some double quotes, say Movies Excel, and then close the double quotes and round brackets, and then finally apply the delete method to that. So just before I run this one, just to quickly reassure you that that connection is still there, I go to the data tab in the ribbon and have a look at the connections page. Movies Excel is still there, and then if I looked at the PowerPivot data model as well again, making sure that the original range and on the diagram view the original range table is sitting there. If I switch back to the VB editor and then run this simple subroutine, I'll find that when that's finished, if I switch back to Excel first of all and have a look in the data menu and the connections page, that my original Movies Excel connection has disappeared, and as the connection has disappeared, so has the table from the data model. So that's the basic way of getting rid of single individual connections or single individual tables from the data model. If you wanted to remove multiple connections without having to remember what they were all called, you can loop over the connections collection and remove each one in turn. Now quite importantly, there is one single connection that you can't remove or delete from the workbook, but let's create a quick extra subroutine. In fact, let's give myself a few extra lines to make this a little bit easier to read, and we'll create a new subroutine that says remove all connections. It won't technically remove every single one, there will be one remaining connection left. But to make this work, we'll use a for each loop, which means we'll need a variable to keep track of which individual object we're pointing to as the loop progresses. So let's create something called a cn variable as a workbook connection. What I can then do is loop over the connection collection, so I can say for each cn in this workbook dot connections. If I say next cn, I can happily print out some useful information just to demonstrate what we've got available there. So if I say debug.print, let's say cn.name for instance, maybe cn. What else could we say? cn.description if there was one. We haven't actually added any descriptions. So let's just say, well, let's say type as well. Let's see what we get for type. If I display the immediate window by pressing Ctrl G or heading to the view menu and choosing immediate window, if I then run that subroutine, I'll end up with a couple of connections listed out. So Movies Excel1 and this workbook data model. Now the one connection you can't delete from a workbook is the workbook data model connection. So if we want to delete all the connections except for that one, we'll need to write a quick simple if statement in that loop. So let's say if cn.name is not equal to and then I'm just going to copy and paste this to avoid mistyping it. It's case sensitive as well. You can guarantee that the Workbook Data Model connection is always called this Workbook Data Model, and there will only ever be one of those for each workbook. So you can safely test for the name being this Workbook Data Model. Then what I'm going to do is say cn.delete. I'm just going to comment out or remove my debug.print statement, and then at that point I'm going to run the procedure to delete all the connections except for this Workbook Data Model. Now if I switch back to Excel and have a look in the Connections dialog box, it will appear as though all the workbook connections have disappeared. But that's not quite true. The Workbook Data Model connection is still available. It's just hidden away behind the scenes because there's nothing in it at this point. If I switch back to PowerPivot, of course, there's nothing to display, so all the other connections have been removed. But you can prove that it's still there, just very simply in fact. If I go to the immediate window and say this workbook.connections.count, I'll prove that there's one single connection available. And if I say this workbook connections one.name, then hit enter, you'll see that it's this Workbook Data Model. So even though it's not visible in the Connections dialog box, the data model connection is still there. Okay, so we've seen the basics of creating the connections and the data model. Let's now move on to looking at how you can create a pivot cache and a pivot table using the data model. So to demonstrate this, I'm just going to close down the immediate window for the moment. I'm also going to head back up to the using range name example, and I'm going to copy this subroutine into a new module. So I copy that, then insert a new module, and then paste that subroutine in. I'm going to change the name of this so it's just called something simple like create basic Excel connection. And we're going to use this as part of a larger routine in a moment, so create basic Excel connection. We're also going to have lots of new worksheets added from this point on, so just to help me to tidy things up afterwards, I'm going to have a new subroutine up at the top of this module that's going to delete everything except for the movies worksheet. So we've done this again in a few previous videos, but let's have a really quick subroutine called delete all but movies sheet. And then we'll have a simple variable dimws as worksheet. And then we'll have a for each loop, so we'll say for each WS in this workbook.worksheets, next WS. I want to check that the worksheet I'm looking at is not the movies worksheet, so if not WS is WS movies, then WS.delete. I want to make sure also that I don't have the alert messages appearing, so I'm going to say application.display alerts equals false just before I begin that loop. So that won't have any effect at this point because I've only got the movies worksheet in the workbook, but as we start creating new worksheets, this will be a really useful little utility. Okay, what I can now do is write another routine that's going to create a pivot table based on this connection. So let's have a new subroutine called create basic model pivot. The first three things that I want to do in there, first of all, I want to delete everything but the movies worksheet, so remembering that we're going to be creating lots of extra worksheets shortly, so delete all but movies sheet. Then I want to tidy up all of the existing connections, so I'm going to call on my remove all connections routine. And then finally I want to create my single basic Excel connection, so I can just simply call create Excel connection or basic Excel connection. So those are the first three tasks in this routine. What I'd now like to do is create a new pivot cache. Now we talked about pivot caches in several of the previous videos. You require a pivot cache in order to create a pivot table. So to make that work, I'm going to declare a couple of extra variables up at the top of this subroutine, and in fact let me give myself a few more lines just to make this a little bit easier to follow rather than it be sitting there at the bottom of the screen. So let's have a couple of new variables. I'm going to have one that will hold a reference to a connection object or a workbook connection, so dim cn as workbook connection, and then dim pc as a pivot cache. Now the connection that I'm going to reference isn't one of my standard workbook connections. I'm going to reference the data model connection. So to make that work, I'm just going to say set cn equals this workbook dot connections, and then I know that the data model connection always has a specific name. It's always called this workbook data model. So I can safely reference that as long as I spell it correctly. I can always safely reference the data connection or the data model connection using that name. And I will know that that one exists at that point because I've just finished calling my create basic Excel connection, which adds a model connection based on that parameter of this method. I can now create my pivot cache based on the connection that I've just referenced. So to do that, I can say set PC equals this workbook dot pivot caches dot create. Now if I open up some parentheses, there are several parameters to fill in here. So the first one is the source type. Let me just put this onto a separate line here. So the source type. Now even though the connection is technically a part of this workbook, the correct type to choose here is Excel external. So source type equals Excel external, and then the source data, this is just going to be a reference to the connection that I've referred to. So source data colon equals CN, followed by another space underscore, and I can also state what the default version of pivot tables is for this particular pivot cache. So I'm going to say version colon equals Excel pivot table version, and I'm going to go for version 15, which is the latest version I have available in this particular version of Excel 2013. So 15 is the internal version number for Excel 2013. So that will create the pivot cache using my internal this workbook data model connection. All I need to do now is create a pivot table that uses that pivot cache, and I'd like a new worksheet for that pivot table to sit on. So again, up at the top of the subroutine, I'm going to declare a couple of extra variables, dim ws as worksheet, and then dim pt as pivot table. And then once I've created the pivot cache, I'm going to say set ws equals worksheets.add, and then I'm going to say set pt equals pc.create pivot table. So we're just going to use a simple method of the pivot cache object. The only compulsory parameter here is the table destination. So just to make this quick and simple, I'm going to put the new pivot table starting in cell A3 on the worksheet that I've just created. So I'm going to say ws.range A3. Okay, so if I close all the parentheses, that will create this basic empty pivot table. And just to demonstrate that that will work, I'm going to run this subroutine at this point. So it should make a few modifications to the data model. It will delete any existing connections if there were any, get rid of any extra worksheets, and then create a brand new worksheet, hopefully, if I look back at Excel, with a new pivot table. If I click into the pivot table, I should see here that I'm referencing the movie range, and I've got access to all of the columns. I haven't, of course, put anything into the pivot table yet, but we'll move on to that one shortly. I should also have, if I look at my connections dialog box, I should have a couple of connections visible, so Movies XL and this workbook data model. And of course that should mean that if I switch back to PowerPivot, I've also got my movie range table sitting there as well. So that's working quite nicely. The next job is to start putting fields into the pivot table. So let's switch back to the VB editor and look at how we can do that. Now adding fields to a pivot table based on a data model works slightly differently to adding fields to a normal pivot table. Just to help us work with this, I'm going to declare another variable, something called CF, as a cube field. Now ordinarily in a normal pivot table you'd be working with something called a pivot field, but in a pivot table based on the data model they're not referred to as pivot fields, they're referred to as cube fields. So what we're going to do is show you how to add in a couple of different fields to this table. So let's start, after I've created the pivot table itself, by setting CF to be equal to pt.cubeFields. Then in a set of round brackets and double quotes I need to refer to the particular field I want to reference. Now again, this isn't quite as simple as with a regular pivot field. Ordinarily with a pivot field, if I switch back to this pivot table and select the movie range, ordinarily I could just refer to, say for instance, the country field. So I just type in the word country in double quotes. But in a PowerPivot data model pivot table, you have to refer to the table name first. So it's going to be movie range, then the country field. So the way that works, the exact syntax for that, if I switch back to the VB editor, is inside these double quotes, I can open some square brackets and say movie range, then close the square brackets, followed by a full stop, then more square brackets, country, close square brackets, close double quotes, and then close the round brackets. Okay, so that gives me a reference to that particular cube field. What I can now do is do something very simple, like set its orientation property. So I can say cf.orientation equals, then I'm going to put the country names as the row fields. Now, although the syntax is a little bit awkward to begin with, it's very consistent. So if I wanted to add something to the column fields, I can just copy and paste these two lines. Excuse me, let's try that properly. Copy and then paste, and then set this to be the certificate field, if I can spell that properly. And then I'll change that so it's equal to the column field, or Excel column field. I can add in a page field fairly easily as well, so I'm going to paste in the same 2 lines that I pasted earlier on, and for the page fields I'm going to put in the Studio column. I'll change Excel row field to Excel page field, and then at that point, before I add in a data field, I just want to quickly demonstrate that this will all work. If I now just run the subroutine, I will end up with a new pivot table eventually, and if I switch back into Excel, I'll find that this time the pivot table has some fields added to it. So again, if I click into the pivot table, you can see that I've selected the country column for the rows field, certificate for the columns field, and studio for the page field or the filters. What we need to do now is add in a field to the data area. Now again, just like with adding row, column and page fields, adding a data field to a data model pivot table isn't quite as simple as with a regular pivot table. What you have to do first of all is get something called a measure. Now again, if you want to know a little bit more about measures, then we've got a whole section of videos on that as part of the Excel 2013 Power BI tools. So they're referred to as calculated fields or measures in PowerPivot. There's a single video there that explains how that works, and a whole range of other videos that talk about how to create your own measures and calculated fields. Just to demonstrate the basics of how this works in VBA, if I switch back to the VB editor, what I need to do first is create a new measure or get a measure for one of my existing fields. So I'm going to copy and paste this, one of the 2 lines that I was pasting in earlier on, the set CF equals PT cube field. I'm going to copy that line and then paste it in a couple of lines further down. Now what I'm going to refer to here isn't just the cube field itself. I'm going to refer to a method of the cube field called get measure. Now depending on which version of Excel you're actually using, in PowerPivot itself these are referred to as either measures or calculated fields. So just to very quickly show you that, back in Excel on the PowerPivot tab in the ribbon there's a calculated fields button in Excel 2013. In Excel 2016 they've changed that back to the word measures, and in older versions of PowerPivot it was also called measures. So it's just in this version where it's called calculated fields. But basically a calculated field is an aggregate of one of the columns in the underlying table. So I'm going to say pt.cubefields.getMeasure, then I'm going to refer to the runtime column. So that was one of the column names in the underlying data source, so runtime with a space in its name. So if I switch back to the VB editor, I can replace studio there with runtime. And then I've also got to refer to which function I'd like to apply to that. So if I type in a comma after the runtime reference, you'll see that I've also got a parameter there that specifies which function I'm going to apply. So this is one of the Excel consolidation functions. So in this case I'm going to use the average function, so Excel average. I could also apply a caption, but that's not relevant here, and the result of that method is a reference to this cube field or this measure. So once I've actually got that created, I can apply it as a data field to the pivot table by saying something simple like pt.addDataField followed by a space and then simply say CF. So that's the field that I've just created. Once it's added to the data fields area, you can reference it in the standard way you can refer to data fields in a regular pivot table. So this bit's fairly consistent. Let's say for instance I want to change the number formatting so it's got 2 decimal places. I know that I've added just one single data field to the pivot table, so I can say pt.datafields, then open some parentheses, and it's a 1 based index, so the first field in there will have the number 1. Then I can change its number format property. Again, the IntelliSense doesn't quite work properly, but I know that this works. I can happily type in number format equals 0.00, so that will give me 2 decimal places. Okay, so having done all of that, if I now run the subroutine again, I will end up with yet another new pivot table eventually, once it's finished, and I will have this time a data field in there as well, which is the average of the runtime column with 2 decimal places. It's worthwhile just very quickly mentioning how we can get rid of all the fields from a pivot table as well. So just to very quickly show you that, back in the VB editor, I'm going to write a completely separate subroutine for this, something called remove all fields, just in case you want to modify an existing pivot table. I'm going to say remove all fields, and then I'm going to have 2 simple variables, dim pt as pivot table, and then, sorry, I'll spell pivot table properly, there we go, and then dim cf as cube field. I'm going to set my pt variable to refer to the first pivot table on the current active sheet. So I'm going to say active sheet dot pivot tables, open some parentheses, and then enter the number 1. And then I can say for each cf in pt.cubefields, So you've got a cube fields collection of the pivot table, of course, we've just been using. I can say next CF, and inside that loop I can say cf.orientation equals Excel hidden. So this one of course relies on you having a worksheet selected which has a pivot table on it, which we know is the case, because there it is. So if I were to just run this subroutine, we'll find that this pivot table now becomes an empty table, but I've still got access to all of its fields, all of its cube fields, and I can add all of those back into the various areas in a different arrangement should I want to. So far then, all we've really ended up with is a basic pivot table, but in a slightly more awkward way than just referencing a regular range of Excel cells. So what's the point of creating the data model in the first place? Well, the PowerPivot Data Model really comes into its own when you're creating data based on multiple different sources all joined together into a single model. If it is indeed just a single Excel worksheet, there's fairly little point in creating the data model version. You just create a regular pivot table based on a regular range of Excel cells. But let's say you were going to use an Access database or a SQL Server database, or a combination of the two joined to some Excel tables or multiple Excel tables. That's where the data model version really comes into its own. So just for the next couple of examples, we're going to create first of all a connection to an Access database, and then to a SQL Server database, then to multiple Excel tables, and finally we're going to join all three data types together into a single model. So for the next part, you're going to need to use a Microsoft Access database. The link should be in the video description, and when you've downloaded it, you've hopefully put it somewhere sensible. I've put mine into a simple little folder on my C drive called Databases, and there it is. So there's my Movies Access database sitting there. If you're not familiar with this database, and we did use it in one of the previous videos on creating pivot tables based on Microsoft Access, I'm just going to open this up really quickly just to demonstrate the main elements that we want to talk about. So back in the Database Tools tab of the ribbon, I'm going to have a quick look at the Relationships window, and this is where data models really come into their own. This is a relational database, so the way the data is stored isn't with repetitive data, if that makes sense. So what we have is a film table containing lots and lots of numbers, basically. So for instance, each film in the film table contains the ID number of a director, and we return the useful information about a director. So for instance, the director's name and birth date and gender by looking up in the director table the director ID number and then returning other information on the same row. So we've got a similar concept for studios and for certificates and countries and languages and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a data model that's based on this Access database, but we're also going to pull in all of the relationships. So we're going to pull information from multiple different tables along with the relationships that are already in the database. So at this point I'm just going to close the Access database down, and then the first job is actually to create a connection to the Access database so that we can steal the connection string for that particular file. An easy way to create the connection string that we need, and again we've dealt with this in a previous video so I won't go into a massive amount of detail here, but if you head to the Insert tab of the ribbon in Excel and choose to insert a pivot table, what we can do is choose to use an external data source. So I can choose to use external data source and then say choose connection. What I can then do is browse for that Access file on my machine. So if I click browse, I can then go to my C drive and then my databases folder in there, and then simply point to my Movies Access database file. I'll then get the option to pick a table. It really doesn't matter which one you pick here. The table isn't going to be part of the connection string, so I'm going to pick just the ACT table, then click OK, and then just click OK one more time. And that will create a basic pivot table that, well, will be based on that single table that I've selected. The important part of all this is, if I click away from that pivot table, on the Data tab of the ribbon, I've got a Connections page, and then I've got a new connection to something called Movies. This is the one that I've just created here, based on this Access database. So if I have that one selected, I can click the Properties button, and that will display the exact properties, all the detailed properties of that connection. The important part here is the definition page, and specifically in there is the connection string property. So if I just widen that dialog box, just so you can see what we're talking about there, there's the connection string that will allow me to connect to that Access database. All I'm going to do at this point is select the entire block of text there, every last bit of it, and copy it to the clipboard. Then I can cancel out of this dialog box and close down the Connections dialog box. Then switch back to the VB editor, and I'm going to create another new module for this. I'm going to insert a new module, and then in there I'm going to create a quick subroutine called something like Create Access Connection. And then in there I'm going to declare a variable called CNString as string, and then in there I'm going to say cn string equals, and then type in some double quotes, and in between those paste in what I've just copied from that dialog box. Now if you watched the previous video, you'll remember there's a few simple things we have to change about this connection string. First of all, just in the same way that we needed the word worksheet to begin the connection string when it was a connection to an Excel worksheet, for this connection type we need to specify that it's an OLADB connection. So at the very start of the connection string, OLADB followed by a semicolon. What we should also do is make sure that this connection is opened up read-only. So the default mode that we've got here, the mode there, we can see is share, deny, write. So it means multiple people can open it, but it means that you can't write or modify the database when somebody else has got it open. So what we're going to do instead is modify the, and that's fairly easy to do. Let's modify the mode, so it's not share, deny, write, it's just read. One other thing we should do as well is make sure that we've changed the way the double quotes in our string are written. You may remember this from the previous video. When you have a double quote in a string, it is not actually converted into a pair of double quotes. Just to very quickly demonstrate, if I switch into the immediate window and say question mark, let's have something like wise double quotes owl. So if I enter that, you can see I only get a single double quote in the string, so that will be the same thing when that's being interpreted by the connection, and that's no good. What I need to do here is make sure that I get a pair of double quotes in my string. So the simplest way to do that is to have 4 double quotes in a row. So if I can show you that, if I hit enter at the end of that line, that will actually generate the double quotes in the string. An alternative there is actually just to remove the double quotes altogether, but my personal preference for this particular example is to double up the double quotes. So going along the string, and again I admit that this is quite a tedious thing to have to do, but going along the string, finding every pair of double quotes, and instead putting in 4 double quotes. So somewhat tedious, I admit, but it's necessary. You need to double them all up, or you need to remove them all together. So let's make sure we've got them all. So that's getting there. It's such a ridiculously long connection string, so I think that looks like we've got all of them. The one right at the end doesn't count, that's just the end of the entire string, of course. So if you think you've got all those double quotes set up and you've made sure that it's you've opened the database in read mode rather than share, deny, write, and you've added the OLADB semicolon to the very start of the connection string, that's the connection string set up. All we have to do now is create a new connection which uses that connection string. So to make that work, I'm going to say, just as we did earlier on for Excel, this workbook.connections.add2. Then again, I'm going to separate out the individual parameters. So I've got name : equals, and I'm just going to call this one access movies, or in fact movies access. I called it movies Excel earlier on, so movies access will be more consistent. And then I've got to pass in a description, but the description, as usual, can be an empty string, so that's what I'm going to do. There's no need really to have a description. And then I'm going to pass an empty string, as I say. The connection string itself, well, we've just generated that and spent all that time and effort doing it, so let's set the connection string : equals cn string. And then the command text. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting. The command text for this particular connection is going to be equal to a list of tables that I want to select. So ordinarily, as we've done in a previous video, we selected just one single table, or we used a SQL select statement, so an actual piece of SQL code stored in the VBA code. Here, all we need to do, quite nicely, is write out a comma-separated list of all the tables we want to select. So in a set of double quotes, I'm going to start with TBL certificate, followed by a comma, and then TBL country, followed by another comma, and then TBL director, and again this is somewhat tedious, but we'll get there eventually. TBL director, TBL film, 2 more to go, TBL language, and then finally TBL studio. So those are the only ones that I want to bring in from that database. I can close the double quotes at the end, followed by a comma space underscore. The next parameter is LCMD type, which in this case is going to be equal to XLCMD type dot XLCMD table collection. Now the last 2 parameters, these are the 2 important ones again. I want to make sure, of course, that I do create the model connection. If the model connection already exists, of course, then it will just be added into the data model as we've seen. So create model connection, Once it's created once, it's always there, you can't technically delete it. So I'm going to set that to be true. And unlike last time when we did this with Excel, we didn't import the relationships because there weren't any relationships to be imported. But this database definitely has some relationships involved in it, as we've just seen in the database diagram. So I'm going to set import relationships : equals true. Okay, so that's the code to create the connection to the Access database. Now from this point on, everything else is essentially the same as creating the Excel pivot table. So let's switch back to the module 2 where we had the code to create our basic model pivot, and I'm just going to copy that entire subroutine and then paste it into module number 3. I'll update its name so that it's called something like, let's call it Create Access Model Pivot instead. Now there are a few things I've got to change here, of course, so I don't want to create my basic Excel connection, I want to create my Access connection instead. So let's change the call to Create Access Connection. Then I'm going to set my connection to be equal to this Workbook Data Model. That's always going to be its name, so we can always rely on that. We'll set the pivot cache to a new pivot cache based on the connection, that's all fine. Add a new worksheet, create a new pivot table at cell A3. What we do need to change are the references to the cube fields. Now because we're using an Access database, this will use the table name and the column name in that table. So rather than movie range, which was our range name from earlier on, this will be called TBL country, and the column name there will be called country name. Then the certificate will be TBL certificate, and then of course that will be certificate name. Of course you'll need to know your database reasonably well to make this work. Then studio will be TBL studio and studio name. And then finally the runtime will be part of the film table, so TBL film, and the column name is called film runtime minutes. Okay, so we've applied the number format there as well to the pivot field, or the data field, so that's essentially all the changes we have to make. The key part, of course, is setting up the connection in the first place to return all those tables and the relationships from the Access database. So all that remains now is to run the Create Access Model Pivot routine. So if I click back into that one and then just hit the Run button to run the entire thing, it may take a little longer to run than the previous one, there's a bit more work to do, but eventually we'll end up with a new pivot table. So if I switch back into Excel, I've got this new pivot table with the country names and certificates and average of runtime. I've got a list of all of the tables from the Access database, so even though I haven't used a couple of them, like director and language, they're still there. And because I imported the relationships as well, if I switch back to PowerPivot and have a look on the diagram view, I'll find that all those tables are linked together, which is fantastic. So there's minimal work to do to actually get this to work. So this sort of technique works beautifully for external databases. We've done it with an Access database. You can equally easily do it with SQL Server as well. So you should find there's another file you can download from the description that will allow you to download a script that will create a SQL Server movies database. Just to demonstrate how that works, and again I've gone into this in lots of detail in previous videos, so just to very quickly talk about this, I'm going to head to my Start menu and open up SQL Server Management Studio. So this relies on you having SQL Server installed or available to you and a SQL Server Management Studio application available. I'm going to connect to my local instance of SQL Server, which is called SQL 2016, and then click Connect. And then I'm going to open up that script that I just showed you to allow me to create my movies database. So I've got a databases folder here that doesn't have the movies database yet. If I choose to open a file, and then I choose to browse to my databases folder, I can just open up my Generate Updated Movies Database script, and then when that's been opened up I can just execute the entire thing to create this database and all of its data. So if I click the execute button, it will run and hopefully return a success message or success messages, and then if I right click on my databases folder and choose refresh, I should find now that I've got a movies database available. Now the arrangement of this database is essentially exactly that of the Access database, a couple of minor differences with a couple of tables, but in the main it's pretty much identical. So I've got a film table with lots of other tables hanging off it, with lots of ID numbers stored in the film table using these key columns, primary keys and foreign keys. So what I'd like to do next is create a connection to this movies database in SQL Server. So I'm going to switch back to Excel first of all and show you how you can create a connection string to that SQL Server database first that we can just copy and paste. Creating a connection to the SQL Server database is kind of similar to doing that for the Access database. There's a couple of extra little steps to follow though. So to start with, I'm going to select a blank cell somewhere in my worksheet, and then from the Data tab in the ribbon, I'm going to choose this From Other Sources. And there's a specific option here, From SQL Server. So if I choose that, it will launch a little wizard to allow me to connect to a SQL Server database. I need to know the server name, which I've just seen actually in SQL Server Management Studio. So the full server name is, in this case, the name of my machine, because it's a local instance of SQL Server, followed by a / SQL 2016. Now because this is my local machine, I can have a quick shortcut to that. I can type in a full stop, followed by a / and then SQL 2016. If I then click the Next button, it will show me a list of databases on that server, so I can select my Movies database that I've just installed. And then for the purposes of demonstration, I can just select any table from that database. It really doesn't matter at this point which table I select. Then I can click Next. Then I get the opportunity to save this connection as a file. So again, it doesn't really matter what the name of the file is. I'll just go with this SQL 2016 Movies TBL Country, and then click Finish, and that will create the connection file. The next step is to ask me to import some data, but I don't need to do that at this point. I've already generated the connection file, so I can happily click Cancel at this stage. Now, in order to create a connection object in the workbook, what I can do is head to the Connections button, and then I can choose to add a new connection. And I'm going to do this based on the file that I've just created. So whatever the file name was that we used to save the connection file, I'm going to select that and then click Open. Now that'll create a new connection in the workbook. I'm going to delete this shortly anyway, so it doesn't really matter what it's called. But if I select that and head to the Properties dialog box, head to the Definition page, then once again I've got this wonderful connection string that I can just happily copy and paste out of that dialog box without having to type it in myself. So I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, then cancel out of this dialog box, close down the connections page, and then switch back to the VB editor. I'm just going to create a temporary place to paste this in for the moment, so I'm going to create a brand new module, which I'm not going to bother renaming, and then in some double quotes I'm just going to paste in the connection string I've just copied. Right at the start of that line, I'm going to type in a single quote and apostrophe just to comment it out for the time being, to turn the whole thing into a comment, because the next thing I'm going to do is copy all the code from module number 3 into this one. So going back to module number 3, I'm going to copy the 2 subroutines from here and then paste those back into module number 4. So I switch back to module 4 and then paste them both in. The next thing I need to do is modify the connection string property here. So rather than using my access connection string, what I'm going to do is copy this entire line without the apostrophe. So I copy my SQL connection string, copy that, or cut it in fact, Control X, and then select the existing connection string and paste all of that in. Now there's a couple of things I need to modify again. Well, one main thing I need to modify. Again, I need to start this connection string with OLADB semicolon to create, to make sure that it's indicated as an OLADB connection rather than a different type of connection. With SQL Server, in this particular case, there's nothing else that I need to change here. So I'm pointing to the Movies database. It's got the credentials based on my Windows credentials. It's pointing to the correct server name. Basically for SQL Server, that's it. I do want to update a couple of extra things, of course. I want to modify the name of the connection I'm creating, so it's called Movies SQL. It's still using the exact same list of tables because the table names in the SQL Server database are the same as those in Access. I don't need to change anything else there. I do need to change down in the second procedure. I want to change the name of the procedure that I'm calling, so I'm going to change the 2 procedure names, create SQL connection and then create SQL model pivot. And then finally in here I can change the name of the call to, rather than create access connection, I can say create SQL connection. Then again, everything else is exactly the same because the table names and the column names match exactly in the Access database and the SQL Server database. So once again, all I should need to do at this point is run the create SQL model pivot subroutine, and that will generate a new worksheet with a new pivot table, but this time it should all be connected to SQL Server. So once that's finished, switching back into Excel, having a quick look, it's not obvious that it's changed at all, but if I have a quick look at the connections dialog box, you'll see that I've got a movies SQL connection. So if I look at the properties and look at the definition, it's connecting to my SQL Server database. So just to reassure you that it's not just copying the Access example. Again, it's got the same list of tables there, and again the PowerPivot Data Model will have a list of the tables from my SQL Server database. So it's incredibly simple, consistent and simple at this point. Once you've done it once, it's pretty straightforward to do it for multiple different types of data sources. Now we've looked at how to bring in multiple tables from both Access and SQL Server. When there's a database with relationships, primary keys and foreign keys already built in, that's really simple and straightforward, because when you create the connection, you can simply tell it to import the relationships and everything works beautifully. But you may find you're in a situation where you've got multiple tables in your Excel workbook, and then when you import those into the data model, you can't choose to import relationships because Excel worksheets don't contain relationships, they don't contain primary key and foreign key information. So what I'd like to do is set up an example now that we can use to demonstrate how this would work for multiple Excel worksheets. I'm going to start by heading back to SQL Server Management Studio just to generate some sample data that I can now copy and paste into Excel. So I'm going to close down the script that I had open earlier on, and then I'm going to create a brand new blank query window. One simple way to do that is to right click on the movies database and choose New Query. I'm using this, we're going to write some very simple SQL code just to select all the data from the actor table, the cast table and the film table. And you'll see why it's those three tables in just a moment. So if you haven't written much SQL code before, don't worry too much. We're not going to do too much in detail here. All we're going to do is say select asterisk from, and then in this case I'm going to say TBL actor. Then I'm going to copy and paste that line. Copy and paste rather than paste and copy. Copy and paste a couple of times, and then just update the table name of these. So TBL actor, TBL cast, and then TBL film. So this is the simplest possible select statement you could write almost. Not really good practice in the real world, selecting everything from a table, but for us it's going to give us some nice simple sample data that we can copy and paste into some new Excel worksheets. So with those 3 lines of code written, making sure you haven't got any single individual part of it selected, make sure you either select the entire thing or select nothing, and then just click the execute button up at the top to spit out 3 separate tables of results. So you can see here that all we've got are the 3 different tables of results listed out in separate little windows. Now the reason I've brought in these 3 tables is because we're going to copy and paste these into an Excel workbook, 3 separate worksheets. The cast table is the one that kind of sits between the actor and the film. It contains the ID number of a film and then the ID number of an actor, and tells us which role or which character that actor played in that film. So what we're going to do is have these as 3 separate Excel worksheets, and then we'll need to be able to create relationships between actor and cast and film and cast to get some sensible results. So I'm going to click into the actor table first, the little cell in the top left hand corner of that results grid. I'm going to select it and then right click and choose copy with headers. Then switching back to my Excel workbook, I'm going to just add in a brand new worksheet, and then I'm going to paste in what I've just copied by pressing Ctrl V. Then I'm going to change the name of the worksheet so that it's called TBL actor. While I've still got this block of cells selected, life's going to be much easier as well if we have a range name for that table of cells. So in the name box I'm going to type in TBL actor as well. I'm then going to just repeat that for both the cast and the film tables. So relatively quickly, back into SQL Server Management Studio. For the cast table, click on the top left hand corner of the grid, right click, copy with headers, back to Excel, new worksheet, paste, Ctrl V, double click the sheet name, TBL cast, and then change the range name to TBL cast as well. And then once more back to SQL Server Management Studio, select the film results, right click, copy with headers, back to Excel, new worksheet, paste, double click the sheet name, or try that at least, double click the sheet name. I'll rename it in a moment. Let's just go with right click and rename. Double click didn't seem to work in that case. TBL film, and then just give this a range name as well of TBL film. So those are the 3 tables of data we've selected. What our job next is to import all 3 tables into the data model. Okay, so just going back to the VB editor, I'm going to insert a new module, and then I'm going to copy some code from module number 2. So back in module number 2, right at the very top, we've got a subroutine that deletes all but the movie sheet. I want to create a new version of that now that deletes all but the movie sheet and my data sheets, the ones that begin with the letters TBL. So if I copy and paste that subroutine, let's just change the name of this one so it says delete all but data sheets. And then we just need to update the if statement. So we want to check, as long as the sheet name is not WS Movies, or as long as it's not the WS Movies sheet, and the first 3 characters of the sheet name are not the letters TBL. So left ws.name, comma 3 is not equal to the letters TBL, then we can delete the sheet. So that will get rid of everything except for the TBL actor, cast and film and the original movie sheet. What I'm now going to do is head back to module number 1 to copy some more code out of there. So back into module number 1, there should be a subroutine in there that says using range name. So I'm going to copy and paste that one, and then go back to module number 5 and paste it in. I'm going to change its name so it's called something like add multiple tables to model. I can happily get rid of the line that says create the new range name because we've already done that previously, so I can get rid of that line. Then I've got a line here that adds the movie range into my data model. So rather than calling this new connection Movies Excel, I'm going to call this one TBL Actor. And then I'm going to change the name of the range that I'm adding into that worksheet, TBL Actor. So I've already created the range names for this. And then I just need to copy and paste that twice more to import the cast and the films as well. So just paste that same set of code, but this time change the name so it's TBL Cast and TBL Cast here as well. And then finally TBL Film. So we've got 3 separate tables of data all imported into the data model. What I'd like to do now is create a pivot table based on that set of data, just to demonstrate why this isn't going to work just as things stand. So to do that, I'm going to head back to module number 2 first of all, and I'm going to scroll down and copy the subroutine called create basic model pivot. We're going to strip out a reasonable amount of code out of this, but it's a neat enough starting point. So let's just copy the entire subroutine, head back to module number 5, and then paste that in down below. I'm going to change the name of this one so it's called create model pivot multi-table. And then let's think about what we can actually get rid of. So I'm going to delete all but data sheets, not all but movie sheet. That's quite important. So let's just change that so it's delete all but data sheets. And then I'm going to remove all the connections, and then I'm not going to create the basic Excel connection. I'm going to add multiple tables to model. So let's change that one, add multiple tables to model. Once I've done that, I can reference my this workbook data model connection and then create a new pivot cache based on that connection, then add a new worksheet, add a new pivot table, and then it's the cube fields that I'm interested in here. So rather than adding in the movie range country, what I'm going to do first of all is add in, let's say, TBL actor. Let's do it in the same order we put them in earlier on. So TBL actor, and I want to refer to the actor gender column. So what I'm going to try to do here is refer to, or create a pivot table that shows me how many males and females, how many men and women starred or played a role in each film in the database. So I'm going to say actor gender, and then the next column will be TBL cast. So sorry, I've done this slightly the wrong way around. The gender is going to be the column field. Let's just edit that as well. Do beg your pardon. So Excel column field. I should have done this ever so slightly differently. But anyway, never mind. So TBL film, and then the film name is going to form the row field. So just to update this, again, it would have made more sense to do it the other way around, but I've started, so I'll finish. So this will be Excel row field. And then I'm not going to have a page field for this example, so I'm going to remove that one entirely. The data field, or the measure that I'm going to create, will be based on the cast table. So all I'm going to do here is count how many cast members there are for each film and gender combination. So TBL cast, and I'm going to refer to the cast ID column. Rather than using Excel average, I'm going to use Excel count, and then there's no point in modifying the number format, there's no point in displaying decimal places, so that's the basic pivot table setup. So at this point, if I were to run this subroutine, I will end up with a pivot table. It's just that it won't be particularly useful at this point. If I let it go through the motions and end up with, hopefully, another new sheet right at the end, if I switch back, I do have a pivot table. It's got the film names down the left-hand side, it's got the genders across the top, but all it's showing me here is that I've essentially got 833 boys and girls in every single film. And the reason for that is because there's absolutely no information contained that explains how these tables are related together. You get a hint about that at the top of the pivot table fields list. Relationships may need to be created, and if I looked at the PowerPivot Data Model, you can see these three tables are just sitting there with no sort of relationship at all. So I can't choose to include relationships. I can't just set the include or import relationships parameter to true because there are no relationships to import. These are just basic Excel worksheets. So what we need to do now is write some extra code that will create the relationships in the model. So let's head back to the VB editor, and I'm going to add this in to the same subroutine that adds the multiple tables to the model. So right down at the bottom we'll add in a new section of code that creates the relationships. This will be ever so slightly easier to do if we declare a new variable which is going to hold a reference to the model object. So I'm going to say dim md as model, and then I can set md to be equal to this workbook.model. Now what I'm going to do is say md.modelRelationships. So this allows me to both view and modify the relationships that are part of the model. So what I'm going to do here is say modelRelationships.add, and there are two parameters that I need to fill in. I'm going to name them both. So I've got a foreign key column. So let's say foreign key column, followed by a colon and an equal sign. Now what I have to do is reference the column in this case it's going to be a column in the cast table. So let's create the relationship between the cast table and the actor table first of all. The foreign key column is going to be the cast actor ID column in the cast table, and the primary key column is going to be the actor ID in the actor table. So that's what I need to specify in this code. So foreign key column equals md.modelTables, open up some round brackets, and I'm going to say TBL cast, but that's going to be in double quotes, TBL cast, close double quotes, close round brackets, dot model table columns, open some round brackets and some double quotes, and then say cast actor ID. Then close the double quotes and close the round brackets. So that's the reference to the foreign key column. If I type in a comma, followed by a space underscore, and then add in the primary key column, again, it helps to know a little bit about the design of your database and about relational databases in general to help with this. But again, I'm going to say this time, just to save a bit of typing, I'm going to copy and paste MD model tables, but it's going to be TBL actor and then actor ID. So that will generate one relationship between the two tables. I've got another one to create, and again I can just happily copy and paste this little section of code, and this will create the relationship between the cast table and the film table. So the name of the foreign key column will be cast film ID, and the name of the primary key column will be TBL film film ID. So again, just having a quick look back at the diagram at this point, you can see we've got a cast film ID in the cast table and a film ID in the film table. So that's what we're trying to specify here. Now just before I run this, I have experienced issues when I've left the PowerPivot window open with the diagram view in place. So I'm just going to right click PowerPivot and choose to close the window at that point. And then what I'm going to do here is just click into the Create Model Pivot Multi-Table subroutine and then just run that one again from scratch. So let's let that one go through the motions, and hopefully what we'll end up with this time, if we look back at Excel, is a new pivot table, but with all the correct counts for the boys and girls in different films, rather than 833 boys and girls in each one. So you can see that we've got the same three tables. If I just open up the PowerPivot relationship view just to see that the relationships are in place, if I look at the diagram view, there they are. So you can see the relationships are in place just as we've specified. So actor ID to cast actor ID, and film ID to cast film ID. So that's quite a neat little technique to use as well, so you can relate multiple different independent Excel worksheets to create a single, basically an entity relationship diagram within Excel. Just to wrap up this video and show you how far you can go with PowerPivot, we're going to create the exact same pivot table we're looking at right now, but it's going to be based on data from three different places: a SQL Server database, an Access database, and an Excel worksheet. So we're going to take the film data from our Access database. We're going to take the actor table from our SQL Server database, and then the cast table will come from our Excel worksheet. So to make all that work, I'm just going to close down PowerPivot again just for the moment, head back to the VB editor, and then I'm going to copy and paste all the code that's currently sitting in, apart from the delete all but data sheets routine. I'm going to copy the two last subroutines from this module number 5. I'm then going to create a brand new module and then paste those two subroutines in, and I'm going to change the names of both of these two subroutines. So I'm going to say add multiple sources to model, and then I'm going to say create model pivot table multi-source. I'll also just change the routine that calls the add multiple tables. I'm going to change this so it says add multiple sources to table, so to model. And then what we've got to do is modify the new items that get added in to the data model. First of all then, I want to get the actor table from my SQL Server database. So let's head back into module number 4, which is the code that I used to create references to SQL Server. And the very first routine up at the top there, create SQL connection. I'm just going to copy and paste the 3 instructions in here, so the variable declaration, the connection string, and the code that creates the new connection to the movies SQL database. If I just copy all that to the clipboard, head back to module number 6, and then in places where I'm referencing the actor table in the Excel worksheet, I'm going to paste all over the top of that. I'm going to paste the reference to my SQL Server database. So I'm going to change a couple of quick things here as well, of course. So I'm going to change the connection so that it's called, actually I don't need to change the connection can be called movies SQL, that's absolutely fine. What I do want to do is modify the command text so that all I'm getting here is TBL actor. I'm now not getting a table collection as the command type, I'm just getting a basic table, so I can get rid of the word collection from the end of that. And I'm not trying to import relationships in this case. There are no relationships between SQL Server and Excel specifically, so I can set the import relationships to false here as well. Next, I'd like to do essentially the same thing, but to get the film data from the Access database. So let's switch back to module number 3, which is where the Access code was. And again, I've got the code that generates the Access connection string, and then the code that adds a new connection to that Access database. So I'm going to copy that from that module, head back to module 6, and then paste over the top of the code that adds the connection to the film table. So I've got my Access connection. I'm just going to update again the reference to the tables I'm getting. So I'm not getting this entire list of tables, I just want the film table in this case, so I can just leave that one in place there, in fact, TBL film. And again, I'm not getting a table collection anymore, I'm getting a single table, and I don't want to import relationships either, so I can change that so that the import relationships is set to false. Now there's nothing to change for the Excel data, that's still getting the TBL cast range. So there's nothing to change there. We've got the relationship set up just as usual, and the column names now all match, so there's nothing to change there. We've updated the create model pivot multi-source to call the add multiple sources to model subroutine. So all we should need to do at this point is run this final subroutine just to create one more new pivot table. And again, letting it go through all the motions, we'll end up with hopefully not a very interesting pivot table, admittedly, because it's just the same as the one we've just been looking at. But the really interesting thing about this is that we've got data from 3 completely different places making up this pivot table. So we've got the film table from Microsoft Access, we've got the cast table from our Excel worksheet, and we've got the act table from our SQL Server database. The beautiful thing is that you don't really even notice that that's the case. Certainly in the Excel workbook you can't really tell. There's a couple of little indications that you're connecting to a database there with a slightly different icons in the table names, of course. So the actor and the film connections have this slightly different icon indicating they're pointing to a separate database. But to PowerPivot, those 3 objects are essentially treated as exactly the same thing. It's wonderful how powerful this can be. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of how you can use PowerPivot in VBA code. Hopefully you'll find some use for that. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the Wisel website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching. See you next time.